Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 16. No one likes a snob. You all know that because none of you like snobs. I've never heard a person yet say, I really like snobs. When I was in school, if you sat down at the snob table with all the cool kids, I was not a cool kid. I'm sure you all are well aware of that. But, if you sat down with the cool kids, they would kind of look at you like you did something wrong. And maybe they'd get up and leave and go to a different lunch table, right? But then when we become adults, we encounter snobs too. There's the Homeowners Association snobs. Can someone shut this door right here? You got to close it really hard, Zenny. It doesn't like to stay closed. But yeah, some of you probably have encountered, you can slam it. There you go, thank you. I heard about a homeowners association. They were very upset. Somebody in the association was upset that someone was hanging their clothes up to dry in their backyard. They would not allow such. They did not want to be in the same neighborhood as people who would dry their clothes outside. But even preachers can be snobs. There was a viral video not long ago of a preacher just yelling at his congregation because they didn't get him the designer watch he wanted that year. And he was saying, y'all couldn't use your McDonald's money to chip in for my watch. He was just going on about it. It was embarrassing. But my point is, you see him and you're like, what a snob. You're only the best for me. There are all kinds of snobs. There's designer clothes snobs, pizza snobs. I grew up in a family of pizza snobs. Even church snobs. Such a thing exists. So what is a snob? A snob is a person who has an exaggerated respect for position and who seeks to associate with social superiors and dislikes those regarded as lower class. That's the Merriam-Webster definition of a snob. Now, the reason I bring that up is because you know what we all love about Jesus? Jesus could have acted like a snob. He has the highest status of anyone in the universe, but he didn't. Jesus could have said, I only hang out with the Roman emperor because he's the most important person, right? He could have said, I only hang out with the most righteous of the righteous. But he didn't say this. He never said, I would be ashamed to associate with wicked people, with poor people, and with diseased people. He never said that. Instead, Jesus intentionally hung out with people that other religious people would be ashamed to be with. He hung out with tax collectors. He hung around in circles where prostitutes hung out. He was known as a friend of sinners. That was his reputation, according to the Pharisees, a friend of sinners. Now, most surprising of all, if you're a Christian today, Jesus has even associated himself with you. Can you believe it? You know yourself better than anyone. And this isn't anything new in the story of the Bible. When Jesus comes along, it's not like, all of a sudden, God is interested in the lowly. He's always been that way. Isaiah 57:15, the word of the Lord said, I dwell in a high and holy place. God is very high and holy, but then he says he also dwells with the contrite and lowly of spirit, those who have a broken heart and a low spirit, those who are humble. He's always done this. So the reason I bring this up is this. We all have a need to learn about how this relates to God, God's character, that God is not a snob. He doesn't want to be associated necessarily with high and upstanding people. But there is a kind of person, this might surprise you, there is a kind of person that God would be ashamed to be associated with. We're going to learn that in the text today. There is a kind of person who God would be ashamed to be called that person's God. And it's not because he's trying to win a social contest. It's because to associate with this kind of person that we're going to learn about today, God would suffer a loss of honor and glory. And so I have a question for everyone here today. Is God ashamed to be called your God, or is he delighted to be called your God? This is important. I mean, wouldn't you want to know if the God that you claim to serve is not delighted in you? I'd want to know that. And then to know, is he ashamed to be associated with me? Or on the other end, maybe you think that God would be ashamed of you because of your past and mistakes that you've made, but then you'll find out today that actually he's delighted to be called your God. Well, how are we going to figure this all out? Well, good news. Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 16 are going to help us by reminding us of the story of Abraham and Sarah, and then it's going to expand on what their faith means in relationship to how God views them and how he views himself as their God. So follow along with me. Hebrews 11, starting in verse 8, the Word of God says this: "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. And these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." If we see this entire text of Scripture as a mountain, the peak of this mountain, I believe, is that clause towards the end. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. So what can we conclude? If there's a kind of person who God is not ashamed to be called their God, there must be a kind of person who God would be ashamed to be called their God. And I think we can discover this from the text. So main point number one, we're going to ask the simple question: who is God ashamed of? Who would God be ashamed to be called their God? I see a couple of principles that stick right out of this text that would give us a clue who these people are. The first group, we could say this: who is God ashamed of? Those who call themselves Christians but won't do hard things in this life. I mean, specifically hard things that God has asked us to do. Now, where do we get this? Verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Abraham was called to do a really hard thing back in Genesis chapter 12. Think about it. He's an older guy. He's in his 70s. He's in his hometown of Ur. And he hears the Lord speaking to him. And the Lord tells Abraham, "Go to a land that I will show you." And God is giving these promises that he's going to give him this land. He's going to make him a blessing to the nations of the world. He's going to give him descendants. And Abraham hears this. And the question you'd want to ask is, well, where is this land? Where am I going? Well, it's a land God will show you. Just start going. This is okay. Well, you want to say, but Lord, I'm in my 70s. How long am I going to be traveling? I've established my life here in Ur. Why would I leave? Well, God has told Abraham to go and receive an inheritance somewhere else. So Abraham, in his 70s, begins to travel by foot, and he travels around 700 miles and ends up in this foreign country to him, the land of Canaan, which he later called the land of Israel. Question, is that an easy thing to do? No, clearly not. That's not easy. That is hard. Now, he's been told, yeah, there's an inheritance waiting, but it doesn't make it any easier to make that trip necessarily. So we know this. Abraham obeyed the word of the Lord and did something really hard. So God says, I'm not ashamed to be called your God, Abraham. What can we conclude? If Abraham did not do that, well, God would have been ashamed to be called Abraham's God. If God said, hey, I got blessings in store for you, here's what you need to do, simply go there and my grace and mercy will pour out on you. And Abraham said, no, too hard. I got other things to do. I'm going to go watch the game in the middle of town this afternoon, and I have other things that I'm interested in. God would be ashamed to be called the God of somebody who treated him that way. Now, I bring this up, but in terms of looking back in the 2100s BC when Abraham lived, but we encounter the same problem with ourselves. Sometimes we hear the Lord commanding us to do something like honor your father and your mother, and we say, but for me, that's really hard to do. I don't feel like it's easy to respect one of my parents, perhaps. And so, Lord, I don't know how I feel about that. We have some hard things given to us as well. And he's not saying, hey, travel on foot to a mystery land 700 miles away, but he's telling us other things, and they are hard things to do. Here's a hard thing to do. Many of you know you're called by God to be a part of First Baptist Church of Vernal. That's not always easy to be part of a local church. You've got to work together on the most important mission in the world. And by the way, you're all sinners, and you all have reasons that you're messed up, and you can rub each other the wrong way, but you got to work together and put Jesus at the center. That's not always easy. Sometimes it's easy. A lot of times it's not easy to be an active part of a church because, man, people just aren't perfect like me, right? You think that about others. No, it's hard work. How about this? Luke 17:3. Say you're going through the book of Luke in your devotions, and you come across it, and Jesus says, you've got to forgive everyone who ever asks you for forgiveness. And you say, well, that's really hard, Lord. This must not be for me because I've been betrayed or I've been humiliated. Somebody's been unfaithful to me. There's no way. It's really hard. But those who call themselves Christians but refuse to do the hard things, I believe we can learn from this text that God would be ashamed to be called that person's God. Because their refusal, anytime we refuse to do hard things, that indicates a lack of faith. We're saying, God, you're not worthy of my trust. I don't know if I trust you. And God would have to lose glory and honor to be brought to a place where he isn't trusted. You don't like when people don't trust you. Well, imagine if the God who created you and the universe and who has only ever given blessing hears from you, I'm not sure if you're trustworthy, God. That's shameful. Who else is God ashamed of? The second bullet point here. Those who call themselves Christians but seek their full reward in this life. We get this from verses 9 and 10 of Hebrews 11. See, because according to our text, Abraham leaves Ur, travels 700 miles, ends up in the land of Canaan, and when he gets there, it's not like there's this big sign that says, welcome Abraham and family, and there's like a vacation package, we got like this resort for you and palm trees, there's a pool and a hot tub, and you got TV in your room and free internet access. Nothing. He gets there and it's just the land of Canaan with a bunch of idol worshipers there worshiping idols, and they don't care at all for his God. That's what he sees. There's not much of a reward when he arrives in Canaan. You get done with this long journey, and in fact, not long after he gets there, they encounter a famine. It's not raining. There's no food. And for a while, he seeks refuge in Egypt to get out of the very land that he was just going to. Verses 9 and 10 say this: by faith, he, Abraham, dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country. He was not at home in this place, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So what does it say? He got there, and he's just living in tents. There's no permanent house. He's this wandering nomad. How could he do it? He waited for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He says, I know my full reward doesn't come now. That comes later by the grace and goodness of God. Right now, I don't get all of the blessings. They don't all arrive right now. So what can we infer from that? Well, if a person said, no, I only want all of my blessings for following God in this life right now, I could infer that God would be ashamed of that person, because he's not ashamed of people who will wait for their full reward. And so, this is easy to do. It's easy to base our serving the Lord on whether or not we can see we're going to get lots of blessings from it right now. How many times have perhaps you been asked, hey, would you serve the Lord in this way? Maybe by the Holy Spirit or somebody at church or whatever. You just know, hey, is this a way you'd serve the Lord? And your response was, I don't see the payoff. I can't see how it's worth it for me to do that right now, because I would lose comfort. I would lose control. I just don't like it. What are we saying? We're saying, I want my full reward now. I'm not going to wait for it later. I'm not waiting for blessings in heaven someday. And when God sees this in us, I believe that there is I don't know how to say it, a fear, not that God fears anything, but a resistance to that, because he can't be ashamed. He would be ashamed to be called the God of somebody who only serves on the basis of a reward I can see and touch right now. And when God, we see other places in the Bible where God expresses this kind of action. Think about when he repented, it says in the old King James Version, that he had made Saul king because Saul was so disobedient. I think back to the story of Genesis chapter 6, the story of Noah and his flood. We read these words as God looks down before he sends the flood and sees the wickedness of man. It says, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the Hebrew is communicating this idea that there's this groaning happening in him, like, oh, look at you people. I've made you. I've given you everything you need to see me and to offer me thanks and to receive my blessings. And all you do is turn away. And there's this groaning. And I believe that if God is to look at us and we're acting in a way that would bring shame to him, that there is the same groan happening in him. It's kind of like you can imagine a modern day scenario like this, where maybe a dad says to his son, hey, if you are good at school today, I'll take you out for ice cream afterwards. And so the son goes to school, and halfway into the day, dad gets a call from the teacher, and she says, hey, your son was beating up another kid to take his snacks at lunchtime. The father would be like, oh, he would groan. It would bother him. Why did he do that? Well, in a sense, he couldn't wait for his full reward after school of having ice cream with dad. He wanted his snack then, right? And it brought dad groaning. I think we can, in a sense, bring God groaning within him when we live in a way that would bring shame to him. Who is God ashamed of? We saw that. Now, let's look at main point number 2. Let's look at a positive direction. I'm ready for that, and I'm sure you are too. Main point number 2, who does God delight in? What I mean by that is who does he delight to be called their God? How else do we say it? We could say, who is God not ashamed of? But let's say, who does God delight in? As we walk through the text, I think we can say this. God delights in, the first bullet point here, those whose desire for heaven gives them patience until death. I'm going to read that again. God delights in those whose desire for heaven gives them a patience that lasts until death. See, in verse 13, as the book of Hebrews is reflecting back, not even just on Abraham and Sarah, but on everyone it's listed so far in Hebrews 11, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them. How did they make it through their entire life? Exercising faith in God because they had such a desire for the fulfillment of those promises. The final fulfillment, which we read in verse 16, is a better country. That is a heavenly country. They were looking forward to that heavenly country which comes later. And they lived this way, in tents and in wanderings and not having tremendous, tangible, physical blessings. They did this until they died. How could they do it? Because of their desire for heaven, a place where God is central. This is the motivation that's inside of a person who has true faith in Jesus Christ. And God looks at that person and he sees them. And of course, his grace and his mercy has worked within them to bring them to this place. But he sees that person, he delights in that person. So it's not that their desire was to set up shop and make the perfect business in Canaan and really make it big, right? They weren't looking for the perfect finances. These people like Abraham and Sarah were not looking for perfect health. They looked forward to a day after this life in which they would dwell with God in his direct presence forever. Because they knew that God was all satisfying, that God is almighty, that God is all protecting, that God is safe, that God is merciful, that God is deep, that God is interesting, that God is active, and that God is holy. And they wanted those things, and God delights in them. He delights to be called their God. We see what is different about them. It is their desire for heaven. Now let me ask you a quick question, though. Were Abraham and Sarah perfect? Did God look at Abraham and Sarah and say, ooh, they're so good. They are so religious. I just love these people. I delight to be called their God. No, Abraham and Sarah were not perfect. They were not even perfectly patient. You remember, if you know the story at all, they knew that God had promised them, Abraham and Sarah, a child, because they were supposed to somehow have descendants that would come from them that would be innumerable. They knew that, but they had no child, and they were very old. And so as they got older, they got really impatient. And at one point, Sarah takes her maidservant, Hagar, and gives her to Abraham and says, maybe you're supposed to have a kid with her, and that will be the one from whom the descendants will come from that God has promised us. That was pure disobedience, pure unbelief, pure impatience. So they weren't perfect people, but they realized, because they have God working in them and through them, whoops, we went in the wrong direction, and we don't want to do that again. And they got back on the right track. So what I'm saying here is God's not waiting for you to become perfect, and then he'll delight to be called your God. He's simply looking for faith in his people. Faith is what pleases God. And so the blood of his son, if you're a Christian, has already been applied to your heart. It has changed you so that now you have the promise of heaven, and you can endure anything with that kind of faith that looks towards a time when I will be in the direct presence of God forever. If you really believe that, and that takes over in your life, you can endure anything. You can endure financial struggle. You can endure chronic pain. You can endure a strained marriage. You can endure a rebellious child. None of these things are easy, but you could do it if your eyes are looking forward to a time when you will be with God, and that situation will never change. I've given a version of this illustration before, but I think we could visualize this pretty easily if you had two people who were going to do a boring, mundane job for a year, and you promised one of them, after this year, I'm going to give you the lump sum of $35,000. But the second person is going to do the same job. You tell them, I promise you at the end of this year, I'm going to give you a lump sum of $35 million. If those people love money, that second person is going to be highly motivated. They're going to be doing their work with a smile on their face, with eagerness and all kinds of planning. I'm going to get $35 million after this year. Whereas the person who's going to get $35,000 is like, man, I don't like this job. Probably, I wish I could get a different one. It's kind of boring. It would be awful. My point is this: if you love God, you're like that person who has this giant lump sum coming after a year of maybe some boring, mundane, difficult work. But you can do it because you know what's coming. You know what's happening? After I'm dead, I get to be with God forever, and I will be with Him. He will be my God, and I will never experience the curse of sin. I will never experience sorrow. I will never experience sickness or loss of any sort. You'll be thinking like that, and you'll be thinking, I want to invest in that, right? Who does God delight in? He delights in those whose desire for heaven gives them patience until death, lifelong patience. Who else does God delight in? Look at the second bullet point. He delights in those whose desire for heaven causes them to live like strangers and pilgrims on the earth. See, if you look back at verse 13, it reflects on those who it's spoken of, especially Abraham and Sarah. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but then it says that they embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. I wonder, Christian, do you feel like sometimes your love for Christ and for the Word of God makes you feel like you're just not at home in this world? I'm sure all of us could say, yeah, a lot of the time. I don't feel at home in this place. I don't know what direction the culture's going to go next. And that's because I love Christ and I love the Word of God. Well, that's what we're talking about. You don't feel like you're at home. And guess what? If you don't feel like you're at home in this world because you love Christ and the world doesn't love Christ, guess what? God delights in you. He delights to be called your God. He is not ashamed to be called your God. I can imagine, here's what it would look like. Some people sometimes take a lower paying job to serve Christ better. You do that, people are going to look at you funny. You're going to be like, you're a weirdo. You'd give up, $10,000 more a year just so you could live closer to your church or do whatever. You have a schedule that allows you to serve in the church, whatever it might be. You're going to feel a little out of place when people confront you on that stuff. Maybe, I've heard this before, maybe you feel like the Lord has convicted you and there's a particular streaming service. You're like, you know what, I don't think we should be paying for this streaming service anymore, because it just has way too much inappropriate stuff. I don't think it honors Christ in any sense, and I'm going to get rid of it. And then you have that friend come over saying, hey, put this thing on your TV for the kids. And you're like, we don't have that. They're going to look at you weird. You don't have that. You don't have that streaming service? What's wrong with you? Look at you like you're a stranger. You're some kind of a weirdo. That's how you end up living when you value heaven and Christ. You're just wandering through this world. It's only temporary. Whereas for others, this world is all there is. Let me give you an example. There is a kind of a well-known story from the history of Christian missions from about 100 years ago. And it was about a young man named William Borden. And he's often known as Borden of Yale. But William Borden, who lived in the early 20th century, he could have inherited the rights to the Borden Milk Company. And that's the family he was in. And he could have been a millionaire in a time when it was super rare to be a millionaire. Still pretty rare, but it was really rare back then. And he would have just had it made for life. But William Borden loved Christ. He was a Christian. And he actually forfeited his rights to inherit the milk company because he said God had called him to be a missionary. And he was fully planning to be a missionary to Arabic-speaking peoples over in the Middle East, and he gave his life to that. Of course, right there, people are going to say, what a fool. You're going to give up millions of dollars? And they'd say stuff like this, well, you could use that millions of dollars to pay for other missionaries to go to the mission field. What's wrong with you? He knew before God where God had called him. And so William Borden takes an initial trip to Egypt to begin to learn Arabic so that he can reach peoples with the gospel and share Christ with them. And while he was in Egypt, he contracted spinal meningitis and died. And so many others would say, what a buffoon. He really messed up. What were you thinking, traveling to the other side of the world? There's poor medical care over there. You can't be taken care of as well there as you could in America. What's wrong with you? I look at William Borden and I say, you know what? God is not ashamed to be called his God. And of course, if you look at his life with an eye on heaven, one thing you know is that his experience inspired many others to go to the mission field. And still today, many people hear of William Borden and they're inspired to serve Christ in a very deep and profound way. A lot of biographies written on him. God worked through him, and God is not ashamed to be called William Borden's God. And if you live like a stranger and pilgrim on the earth in such a way that people look at you like there's something wrong with you because you love Christ and you look forward to heaven, people might be ashamed to be associated with you, but God would not be ashamed to be called your God. Now, I want to expand on this whole idea of God being delighted in those who have true faith in him and those who, though we might mess up at times, ultimately we are looking forward to heaven where Christ is. There's something, and main point number 3 is going to focus on this, that we want to focus on. That is, what has God done for those that he delights in? If you are somebody who has put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, that he rose again, he is worthy of being your Lord, you've given your life to him by faith, I just described your heart, that you are somebody who looks forward to heaven, and that's where your patience comes from. And I just described you as often you feel like a stranger and a pilgrim on the earth. And so if that's you, well, what has God done for you as one that he delights in? The first thing we learn in our text today is this: he has prepared a city for us. That's the main point, or the first bullet point there. God has prepared a city for those that he delights in. It says that in verse 16, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I puzzled over this verse for a long time. I was like, what is the word for there for? I couldn't figure that out. And I looked quite a bit at it and found a wonderful translation handbook. I want to read to you this part of verse 16 in terms of a good way to translate it so that it's well understood. God is not ashamed to acknowledge them as his people, and this is shown by the fact that he has prepared a city for them to live in. That's really what the original Greek is communicating. How do we see that he's not ashamed to be called their God? We see it by the fact that he's prepared a city for them to live in. Where's this city? What is it? Cincinnati, Dallas? Well, what city has he prepared? This is the city of Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem, the capital city of the new creation coming in the future, a place where sin is absent, sickness is absent, suffering is gone. God is central. And what we have before us in this city, when we live there, is the opportunity to explore and enjoy and glorify God forever. And it will be the most satisfying, exciting, and inexhaustible thing we could possibly imagine. I've heard one preacher refer to this time as the eternal honeymoon. The joy of pursuing God and getting deeper into our relationship with God will never go away saying, well, that wasn't satisfying. We will find him to be the source of all satisfaction and everything that we desire in our heart. This is what lies before us as we live in this city he has prepared for us. And then to think about those two words, for them. For he has prepared a city for them. He's made this city for you, Christian. That's a big deal. I mean, you can think back to all the gifts you've ever received in your life. Maybe when you were a kid, there was that special toy that always stuck out. I remember for me, there was this big G.I. Joe toy that my mom got me. I couldn't believe it because we didn't have a lot of money. I was like, look how big that toy is. And I always thought that was the best toy I ever got, right? And then maybe for some of you, the best thing you've ever gotten was some jewelry. Or maybe you had received something that was really meaningful from someone. Well, nothing can compare to this gift that God has for believers a city where he is the center of that city. It's for you, Christian. Now that is encouraging. And I know I need to be reminded of that often. What an exciting thing. What a motivating reality. What else has God done for those that he delights in? He's given us a great desire for his city. Hebrews has talked a couple of times already about when we come to faith in Christ, it's not just that it's the old you and now you have a new set of rules or something. No, when you come to Christ, you have been changed by God. Your nature has been changed. And what it has told us twice in the book of Hebrews is that we have a new heart, a new set of desires, a new set of emotions. And our heart beats for heaven because we know heaven is about God. And we now are motivated by that. See, the world could say that they like the idea of heaven too. But when you tell them God is the center of heaven, they don't like that. Like, ooh. If you think to the depictions of heaven on movies, notice who's often missing God. It's just a bunch of people and white clouds. They don't like the idea of God being there. But when you are a Christian, your heart has been changed so that you say, I want to go to the place where God is the center of attention. That's where I want to be. And it says in verses 14 and following in our text, for those who say such things, meaning that they're pilgrims on the earth, declare plainly that they seek a homeland, meaning heaven. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they came out, this world, they would have opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. We desire this city. We desire the New Jerusalem. We want to be in this place and to invest in this place and to live for this place. And so I look around and I can see this motivation in people. I marvel that some people are willing to drive so far to come even to our church, and I've seen this at other churches too, but they do it because they say, you know what, God's called us to this church, and it's worth it. They're thinking about God. And they want to be where God is, right? And they're thinking about, well, someday I'm going to be with God. So if he's called me to come to this church and it's really far away, I'm going to do that. You can see that desire for God in these kind of things. I see others who, when they came to Christ and put their faith and trust in him, they were rejected by their family. Or if they weren't rejected, things just got really tense in their family because their family doesn't value Christ and they do. And you think, man, what would motivate them to do such a thing? They're serving the God of heaven, with whom they fully expect to be with for all of eternity. So to them, it's worth it. Without God giving us this desire for heaven, we would be in total bondage to this age. That would be so depressing. To say, my whole life is lived to flourish in this time and in this place, like the weirdest time and place to live, it seems like, in all of history, right? When men don't even know if they're men anymore. Like, yeah, that's the time. Everything about you is going to be you living in this time. That's not the case for the Christian. We don't live for the things of this age, and we don't live for lottery winnings and fleshly pleasures and the uncertain comforts of this world. We live for a place that we fully desire to be in, and that desire is our heavenly country that God will one day call us into. What else has God done for those that he delights in? This is really good. You can't miss this last one. He gives us a foretaste now of our future eternal blessings. So God's not saying in this text, like, hey, if you're one of my people, earth is just going to be totally desolate and miserable for you, and then you're going to die. It's not heaven. This world's not heaven, and it's not supposed to be heaven, but Christians get a foretaste of heaven even now. Where do we see that? So when the text told us about Sarah, we had learned, God's working through her, that God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, and that this child would lead to them having innumerable descendants to populate the land that God gave them. But remember, Abraham and Sarah were old and childless. How could it happen? Well, it would take divine power. When Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, she conceived and gave birth to their first child. You say, that's impossible. That's the point. This is the power of God. This is the divine power of heaven, and you get a foretaste of that as a person who has faith in this God. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. Skip ahead. Therefore, from one man were born as many as the stars of the sky, a multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. This really happened. They didn't get to see the full extent of that promise, but they certainly saw the power of God when Isaac was born. That's amazing. And you too, Christian, you'll never see all of the blessings of heaven in this present life. But you, and as a Christian, will get a foretaste of this. And those who reject God don't even get a foretaste of it because they're not looking for it, they're not living by faith. And God, you say, well, where could I see a foretaste of the power of heaven around me? I don't get it. Where is the power of heaven? I'd like to see it. And in this room even, if you knew, and you heard the stories of everyone in this room, and I've got to hear a lot of your stories, you would be astonished about how many people you're sitting next to whose lives were turned around completely with no other explanation but the power of God. I think about how I knew a lot of meth addicts when I was in Oklahoma. I'd encounter them quite often. And I remember asking the head meth cook of Beaver County, he was dead because he blew himself up when he was cooking meth, but his wife was still alive. And I asked her, have you ever met a person throughout all of the Oklahoma Panhandle who tried meth and got off of meth? And she said, she thought about it, and she's like, I can't think of one. And I was so disconcerted. It's like, man, that is a powerful addiction. But then, as I moved on from there, the Lord let me meet more and more people. I've learned, you know what? God can get people off of meth. And there's no explanation for it. It's just the person just was able, by the power of God, to put that addiction behind them. That's not normal. Physiologically, that's not normal. Biologically, that's not normal, but it happened. We can look all over and see the power of God supernaturally working around us. Let me tell you one quick story as we get to the end here. In 1912, there was this medical missionary named William Leslie. He served for 17 years in the Congo, over in Africa. And he lived purely for heavenly concerns. But he felt at the end of his life, he's like, man, I don't feel like I got anything done for Christ. I just don't see much fruit for my ministry, because he couldn't see anything happening. But the reality is God was at work through William Leslie. And although he retired and then a few years later passed away, in 2010, a missions researcher was researching in Congo and discovered this cluster of churches out in the villages. And actually, they were very solid and secure, had a long history going back almost 100 years, right? And they had built a 1,000-seat stone cathedral. And this missions researcher was like, where did you guys hear the gospel? And he found out it all went back to William Leslie. And I hear that story, I'm like, man, that is awesome. This guy couldn't see anything happening at all, but the power of God was working through him. And now we can look at the big picture and say, that's the power of God. We get a foretaste of heaven when we see these kind of things happening around us. And we could have story after story after story. But God gives a foretaste to those that he delights in now of their future eternal blessings. And that's pretty exciting. It should be exciting to anyone here who claims to have faith in Jesus. And so the same question rings out at the end of the sermon that we asked at the beginning. Is God ashamed to be called your God? Or is God delighted to be called your God? Well, you could ask it another way. Are you merely calling yourself a Christian, but you're just driven by temporary pleasures and the comforts of this world? You want to evaluate and repent today. But it could be, too, that you're sitting here and your faith in Jesus has driven you because you think often of eternity and of heaven. And you say, I want to invest in heavenly things. And my thoughts are on heavenly things. And my motivations and my decisions are built around my eternal future. If that's you, because of faith in Jesus and God's work in your life, God is delighted with you. But I think all of us here would know if we have to make a change in our life, and if God is working in us and we need to call out to him, as we're going to be singing Amazing Grace here in just a moment. It's a very well-known song. You don't have to look at the words probably. But if that's you, when we sing our closing song, I want you just to call out to the Lord in your heart and say, Lord, help me to live for the eternity you've placed before me. Now, there could be one other group here, and of course I know that there are some, who are not even Christians. Heaven's not on your radar. You just think, well, isn't a Christian a person who goes to church and says religious things? No, a Christian is a person who has repented of their sins and put their faith and trust in Jesus, that he died for their sins and rose again. And if you've never given your life to Christ, you never put your faith and trust in him, I would invite you to turn to him today. If you have questions about that, you can come talk to me after the service. I'd love to visit with you about it. The Bible promises this. Everyone who calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. Romans 10:13.